Every one of us who is involved in trying to figure out like what if the facts before us lead to a certain logical conclusion. This is what parents do when their kids tell them a story. This is where I was last night. We are taking all of the evidence that we have, and then we are looking at the possible explanations for this evidence. And we are trying to figure out which of those possible explanations is the most reasonable in light of the evidence at hand. So if your son or daughter comes home and tells you a story, but doesn't seem to match up with the evidence, you're going to be questioning him a little further, right? Well, this is a skill set that most of us don't take for granted, and we use it all the time. And we ask jurors to use this skill set all the time because I'm going to offer an explanation for this evidence, and the defense might offer a different one. You're going to have to figure out what the most reasonable inference is from the evidence. Well, that's called abductive reasoning. And this is something that I used when I was trying to figure out which of the potential explanations for the resurrection, for example, was the most reasonable. Because as an atheist, I've heard people, and I also would have said, well, maybe it's just all a lie. Maybe they imagined it. Maybe they, saw a vision that they didn't actually really occur. Maybe he wasn't really dead on the cross. He just was kind of injured badly and just was resuscitated rather than resurrected. There's lots of ways to explain the data. The question is, which of the maybe he just actually arose from the grave the way the gospel authors claim. Well, which of those is the most reasonable? That's the process that we would call abductive reasoning. And we try to do this in the book because at some point, the most critical claim, the most important piece of evidence in the Christian worldview is the resurrection. If that occurred, it changes everything. This is why Paul puts that stake in the hill, when he talks about it in 1 Corinthians 15, that this is the thing that I learned and saw with my eyes, at least the risen Christ, but then learned about the resurrection from the disciples who he appeared to. This is the stuff that he can put the stake in the mountain for a lot of other issues. He doesn't. He puts it on the resurrection. So in the end, that's really what we're using this evidence for. We're reading the Gospels to see not what I couldn't really care less about what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount as a non-believer. I needed to know, did that resurrection occur? Because if it did, I'm going to look at the Sermon on the Mount completely differently. So it turns out that's the first domino that has to fall for every other domino to have impact.
Then he's more than just a wise sage.
That's right.
Well, in the third chapter of your book, you argue that every good detective needs to learn to, and I quote, respect the nature of circumstantial evidence. Do you like that you get quoted here?
Well, and that's something that I think is such a huge part of the work I've been doing in the last, all the years since I wrote Cold Case Christianity. And this version you're probably looking at is the newer version. It's the 10th anniversary version. 10 years ago, I think that still a lot of people, and even today, a lot of people don't understand what circumstantial evidence is and how to think circumstantial. They think that word is such a pejorative, right? It's like, all they have is a circumstantial case, or that's purely circumstantial, as if to say this is somehow lesser. I hear all the time people will say, well, you have no hard evidence for Christianity. Well, there is no hard evidence for anything because it's not a category. There's only two forms of evidence in any case. That is direct evidence, eyewitness accounts, and indirect evidence, everything else. Now, we also call indirect evidence circumstantial evidence, but fingerprints are indirect evidence, circumstantial. DNA is circumstantial evidence. If it's not an eyewitness account, it falls in the indirect category or circumstantial category. So if we're going to make a case just from DNA, we have no eyewitnesses, well, that's a circumstantial case. And certainly most people would not say, oh man, it's just it's all they have is DNA. Look, in the end, we have to understand the categories of evidence. Now, it turns out we've got both kinds of evidence for the Christian worldview, and understanding how they fit and how to build a cumulative circumstantial case that points to the same inference is an important role that most of us as detectives have to take care of in front of a jury. It can also help us make the case for Christianity.
And so, as you write in several of your works, circumstantial evidence is a strong case if it's, as you put it, 1,000 paper cuts, right? Death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Death by 1,000 paper cuts, yeah. And what's interesting is that then you say, well, what counts as evidence in a circumstantial case? Everything. Every little thing that you would walk by, which is why it's so fun to work cold cases, because a lot of even detectives don't understand the power of the stuff they might have walked by 30 years ago. And so we get a chance to go back and look at that and say, well, look, if I add this and 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 this, and I got 1,000 little things, Well, wow, what's the best inference from all of that data? And sometimes the first investigator on the cases that I've worked maybe stopped short. He collected 8 things. Well, there was
Hmm.
probably 80 things he could have collected
Hmm.
if he was really thinking outside the box. And what's missing from the crime scene, for example. Most people don't think about that. But most crime scenes have stuff that's there and stuff that could be there but isn't. And
Hmm.
the question becomes, well, why isn't this here? And so
Hmm.
so you can actually make a case from stuff that's missing, from
Hmm.
words that weren't said, from behaviors that weren't performed or observed. So the negative is as important as the positive sometimes.
So, without reasonable doubt, could you comment on that a little bit?
Well, yeah, because
Misunderstanding
sometimes
what that means.
one thing that'll help, I think most of your listeners or anyone who's trying to make a case for anything is to understand what is the standard of evidence. At what point is enough enough? At what point can I say, well, like, do I know anything beyond a possible doubt? No. We don't try cases beyond a possible doubt because you can never convict anybody. The standard rather of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the reason why that standard of proof is set there is because every case has unanswered questions. I can't answer everyone's questions. And I have to ask jurors before I impanel them. Are you the kind of person who can render a verdict, even though you're going to have significant unanswered questions? It turns out you're good at this because everyone does this every day. We start our car. We have all kinds of questions about how the car operates. You put a key in your door lock. You don't know how the tumblers in the lock work, but it works every time you do it. So, with all those unanswered questions, you continue to open your door. So, there are just things that we don't have answers for. And every case I've ever worked in front of a jury, I told them up front, I can't answer every question. Now, the distance between reasonable doubt and possible doubt is the gap of your unanswered questions. And most of us are able to render a verdict, even though we have unanswered questions.
Hmm.
So you can get to reasonable doubt, but that's much lower than possible doubt. And so
Hmm.
that difference is important. And I'm not trying to prove Christianity beyond a possible doubt because that would be stupid. I can't prove anything. I can't even prove that you and I are really having this conversation beyond a possible doubt. For all I know, you're an AI generated host, and that's going to
I'm
be
pretty
coming
good at
soon.
that.
Yeah, at some point that will be a fear or a possibility. But the point I'm trying to make is that you can't prove anything beyond a possible doubt. So if you can be realistic about your standard of proof, you can go a long way to making a case.
Hmm. Well, in chapter 4, you make the case that every good detective must be able to evaluate the reliability of witnesses. Would you please help us think through, like a cold case detective, as it relates to witnesses and the biblical text?
Well, let's just say one thing about that'll be helpful, I think, for people, and that's that no witnesses in any case I've ever worked have ever agreed 100%. Doesn't happen. We actually ask the dispatcher before we get called out to a scene to separate the eyewitnesses, have the officers there separate them. We don't want them sitting and talking to each other for an hour before the detectives get there. Because if they do that, they're just going to start to merge their stories. They're going to start to say, well, maybe you're right, and I saw it wrong. And then they start to kind of make all of their stories sound the same. Not because they're trying to deceive anybody, but because that's just the nature of how humans interact. And we don't want that. We want there to be significant differences between their stories because in the end, we know those differences are not a contradiction. Even if it just happened an hour ago, are we going to deny that it happened because there are differences in the way each witness describes it? No, we're going to have to figure out, like, why are they describing it differently? Well, the same thing is true of the gospel authors. When I first read them, I realized they don't describe the scenes exactly the same way. And there are several places where you're scratching your head, like, how do I even resolve this? Is this resolvable? This is the question with every set of witnesses. And so I think it's important for us to realize that the differences in the accounts do not disqualify them. Instead, they should provoke you to investigate them.
And tomorrow, actually, I'm teaching a hybrid, intensive 2 days on the Gospel of Matthew. And I bring this up and I really quote from you as it relates to that, because as you're saying, that's we struggle with the so-called synoptic problem and how these different
Right.
authors writing about the same perspective. You're saying it's not really a big issue as scholars are making it out to be.
No, it's not the synoptic problem. It shouldn't be called that. It's actually it's a virtue for us to be able to see it. Because if you had, let's put it this way, if there was no problem, quote unquote, in so much that every one of these, the three synoptic gospels matched word for word, you would say, why do we even have three gospels? This is
Mm.
all just one account that's been, as a matter of fact, usually critics will say, well, where I see there are what appear to be almost word for word copies or repeats, then they say, there's a problem. Well, look, this is often the case, right? Where if look at what John does, fourth gospel out. John, you can tell, my wife and I are reading the Gospel of John right now as part of our daily readings, and we're in the 5th chapter. It's so obvious that John is fully aware of the synoptics and is simply trying to fill in the details. Yet at certain places, you will see he's very similar. He's going to be very similar to other accounts, or he's certainly aware of other accounts. Well, this was the case also of eyewitnesses. If I interview you 10 years after I interview somebody else, or even just 10 weeks, and you are aware of what that first witness told me, you may very well say it the same way. You may very well say, well, yeah, just like John said, or just like Joe said, and you'll just give me the same paragraph. But you're going to add something different, some twist that's your own perception, that's your own way of seeing the scene, or what it was you preferred to focus on because of your life experience, your preferences, your desires, your interests. This is very common in eyewitness accounts. And so it's not just, so to look at what might look like a parallel and to redact it out to say it's not true, that's a false way to approach eyewitness accounts. Because you have to remember, when we have eyewitnesses, typically they see the event at the same time. Then they are interviewed in the same afternoon. And when that happens, you have much less of that kind of parallel. They haven't had a chance to talk to each other about it yet. But if you wait 4 weeks and now you interview 2 and 3, well, now you're going to hear some of number 1 in the 2 and 3, plus their own spin, their own perception. If you wait another 3 weeks and interview number 4, you're going to get some of 1, 2, and 3, and then you're going to get his or her perception added to that. That's just the way these kinds of cases work. It doesn't mean anything's false. It doesn't mean there's lies in there. You can test that. The question is, but you shouldn't kick it out either. You have to investigate every single line and don't assume because you see a parallel or because you see as an apparent discrepancy or a contradiction. These aren't really contradictions if you work them out. But by the way, defense attorneys love to call them that in criminal trials. So don't be surprised when critics of the Gospels will point them out and say, how can you resolve this?